you know at some point you're going to have to tell them, well, not really. And when they begin to ask, hey, the Bible says that those who believe will be able to do these things, and
The Puritans used very, very like, I think the phrase is literally making love to Christ. That was literally
really try to grasp a hold of what he's commending to his audience. You can't grasp a hold of it. It is literally like a bait and switch. There's no way. How are you going to get?
I started doing online dating. Saw this sister's profile. This is going so well. We should get face to face. This is embarrassing. That happened about 5 more times. At some point, how do you as the Christian not feel like you're participating in an elaborate catfish scheme? I want to run through 3 areas where I believe the signs of the catfish show up. So we are in it to win it. We're back again. And this is the first time we'll get a chance to announce this is no longer the podcast with no name. This is now the podcast called, you want to say it, Jay Witt?
Ichabod.
Ichabod. And for anybody who's like, Icha what? Ichabod is taken from, what is it, 1 Samuel 4 or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what it is?
I believe so. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Let's make sure. I mean.
Oh yeah. A mother was told to name her son Ichabod with a B, because in the Hebrew, what that means is the glory has departed. This was God's judgment on the people. Like, yo, it's a wrap. I'm out. Mm-hmm. Ichabod is sort of embracing just that whole idea of it's a wrap. I'm out. Mm-hmm. And whatever glory there was, people are like, yo, you've changed. You're not the same Brady. You're not the same Albert. You're not the same. You guys probably don't get that. I still get that. I'm with that. I'm with the glory departing. I'm departing. And so whatever glory I lose, I think I gain just insanity. So I'm
what did he say?
For that.
As soon as you said depart, I heard the passage in my head. In the last days, many will depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils.
And isn't Jesus going to say to some, depart from me, I never knew you?
Exactly. Yeah,
so this whole idea of departing, I know some people are like, why would you ever embrace that? You've heard us say this several times before. It's worth embracing. The things I would have had to embrace to be able to continue believing, I'm fine with letting that go. And if departing means the glory is gone, I'm fine with that as well. So yes, this is Ichabod. I don't know if you guys want to share anything that makes you say, hey, I like that name. We all, Jay Witt actually is the one that said, yo, I think I got it. And he threw it in the group chat. And I was like, I love it. What was it? Anything other than what I just said that made either of you say, yeah, let's rock with that, other than it just being freaking clever, the nice play on words there?
Yeah, I just like the play on words as well. I liked there's like a syncopation to it almost in a way, and I feel like it can stick. It feels sticky. That was the. And and it's just something that we can just go at infinitum in terms of trying to figure out the best one here and there. But it all made us laugh, so I thought that was it was great.
Part of the reason why I like it as well is I still got people to this day, letting me know they're praying for me, and I'll be back in the faith, and praying that I'll come back to the fold. And I'm like, yo, that it's a wrap. It's a wrap. Like that ain't happening.
Yeah.
And I want to help you all embrace my non-embracing of the Christian faith. And so I think that's another reason why the name stands out to me. How about you, Jay Witt?
While you're talking, I'm like, it might be sufficient for us to have as our logo the peace symbol with the hands, like the peace out. Because it's like that's the sentiment essentially. Is like, yo, I'm out. I departed. You know, we out of here. No, I agree, brothers.
Cool. All right. Well, tonight we're gonna just dive right in. The title is probably already making people say you're gonna have to explain that. And I know we still have people, especially Christians, who are like, you're probably sitting there like, I don't know why I'm even watching this. I'm definitely not going to subscribe. I'm definitely not going to like, but you're going to watch for all the different reasons that you're going to watch. Maybe you just need ammo. You want to know what you need to contend against. Maybe you're curious. Maybe you're interested. Maybe you are like some others, like seeing the merit in some of the things we're saying and just trying to figure out, what is it all going to mean for you. But this is an appeal to subscribe to the channel, to like, to drop a comment. All of that helps the channel continue to grow, even if it's nothing more than just a conversation that needs to be had. So you don't have to feel like God's going to send you to hell or strike you down if you give a like or give a subscribe. You're just basically coming in to have a conversation. That's all you're doing. So hopefully there's no harm in that. But I don't know. So that being said, we are going to dive into. You see the title. We called this "CatFishers of Men," and I guess you could tell, me being a wordsmith in my former life, there's something about this, this podcast where we like those catchy titles, the double entendres and triple entendres and all that. But what are we going to talk about? CatFishers of Men. This idea of last time, or maybe 2 weeks ago, 2 episodes ago, I should say, we talked about the Bible being engineered, this social engineering, engineered in such a way as to shut down independent thought and to silence dissent. If you adopt that kind of worldview or a faith that does that, it will not be long before you find yourself engaged in that kind of activity. You begin to think that way, where you're shutting down parts of your mind so that you don't venture into forbidden waters, and then you kind of help other people like, don't think that. But last time this is what the biblical authors were sort of doing. Today we're going to talk about how what we even, when we were Christians, several of us have had that feeling of, man, I feel like I've got to get engaged in that same kind of activity where I'm almost lying to people, gaslighting people, setting people up for to be let down. And I'm going to ask Jay Witt, you said something, we were talking off camera, about having this feeling where you were listening to atheists to debate them, coming up with defenses, and then you begin to feel a certain type of way. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I want people to understand that I too was once a believer. I too listened to people like me previously. It was only by exposure to solid critical thought that I was able to eventually punch my way through. I know some of you might think that I'm your enemy, but I know I'm not your enemy because I used to be you. You see, so it's hard. It might be hard for you to see me that way, but it's not hard for me to see myself in you. So
talk about that. Yeah, talk about that. Listening to people with antithetical thoughts and how you got to punching your way through.
Yeah. So it starts by just, Brady likes to use the term still manning your opponent. And basically it starts by trying to be as charitable to your opponent as possible.
You're saying that as a Christian, that's what you were doing when you were listening to atheists?
Absolutely. When you're engaging people that you actually have an ought with, the tendency is to not see anything good in them. And because you know your bias leans in that direction, the best way to approach it is to try to look at them from a perspective where you see it as broad and positive as it can possibly be seen from your perspective. That will help you to make a better, more robust argument against them.
Okay, so now let's go into that's what you were doing, and how did
Yes.
that lead to?
And so, lest I give any particular video or individual or writing all of the credit, this was, again, this is aggregated. This is not a singular occasion. It's just by regularly coming into contact, because we were encouraged and admonished by the text to be ready to give a defense for faith, and I took that seriously. So this meant I felt like I had to consistently. This wasn't at the expense of spending devotional time in the text, but on my leisure time, I was also trying to understand other ways of that, the way the world saw us, so that I could build adequate arguments in defense of what it was that I believe. And that's just an interesting place to stop for a brief moment. Just consider the fact that you have a worldview where you're regularly on defense. That's something that I haven't had since I left the faith. And you might not feel that that's a burden right now because you're in the faith and this is your norm. But that, even though that's an assumed disposition from the text, it's not a necessary disposition for a human being to have. So the idea that
basically you imagine, for anybody who may be lost in what Jay Wood is saying there, imagine spending your entire life standing like this, tensed up to take a blow and prepared to give a blow. Imagine going your entire life, and everywhere you go, you get on the bus and you stand like this, and you go into work or to school and you stand like this, and you go in the cafeteria. Imagine, who was it? It was one of my favorite kung fu flicks, a Jet Li flick. He's fighting an older martial artist, and the older guy says to him, "No, see, your stance is wrong. If you're always hard, ready to attack, you can't defend. If you're always defending, you can't. You need to loosen up a little bit." And I think that's sort of, I just got that picture. I don't know if that connects for anybody else.
That's good.
But yeah, you said it's not a natural disposition to always be like this. And then Jay Witt said, since deconverting, he's been able to relax that stance and not have to stand that way 24/7. I just think that's something that's worth thinking about. But go ahead.
That's a great analogy.
Just to give a slight amount of context and background, apologetics was a big part of my life. Being in that kind of defensive mode, there's a common thread with me as well. One of the interesting things that I thought was fascinating, 10 to 15 years ago, was learning about B.B. Warfield, right? His role at Princeton was, polemical and didactic theology, right? So his role was to find any kind of new theology coming out of Europe and, hearing it, and then he would just find a polemic against it, right? That was his job. So I, found that really fascinating. I largely adopted his apologetics, I would say, as a Reformed person. And I just consumed a lot of content, similar to Jay Witt, similar to some other friends of mine who, listened to people with contrary opinions, because we truly believed that Christianity was the truth, and we thought that there was always a reasonable defense against, the attacks that came on the faith. So, I guess to answer your question, Brady, right? It's when we're hearing and listening to these things, being open-minded about it a little bit, right? Because you have to, in some sense, try to understand what the argumentation is, number one. And, in any kind of good scholastic methodology, to be able to frame their arguments the best way that you possibly can in order to actually take it down, right? And, over time, those things essentially, I can probably say that the Christianity just became less persuasive over time because when I tried to apply that method as much as the best to my ability that I could.
I remember being with a friend in the car talking to him and using presuppositional apologetics on him, and he just got really pissed at me because the way I was using it, I had him basically in this jujitsu move, and he felt like he couldn't move logically out, and I was quite proud of myself, but it wasn't friendly, it wasn't nice, and even though it was working, it didn't mean I was right. It just meant I was winning an argument. So there's a difference between winning an argument and being right. Another person may not be equipped with the proper amount of education and as a logician and being able to counter the arguments that you're putting, or to see the flaws and the cracks in your argument. But that doesn't mean that you're right. It just means that you've won up your opponent. And so so there's a difference between being able to put together an apology, an argument for a position that is plausible. We'll go back to that word plausible, and it actually being a genuinely good, solid argument. And that's a fine distinction, but it's a very important one, because what I saw is that I could continue along the same lines that I was going when I was encountering this unbelieving thought. But what would happen is I would just be I might have a leg up on other people, like a common person on the street who hasn't been schooled. And this is why, incidentally, a lot of Christians, apologists, they study logic. They, like a person like Bonson, he was like a Greg Bonson was a genius level logician, like very good with logic. And it's almost like training in a particular martial art so that you can take down your opponent who's just like a street fighter or something like that. This does not mean that your arguments are great. It just means that you're particularly skilled with the art of argumentation, and you're able to kind of lock people up. I believe that's what happened with him in Gordon Stein. Gordon Stein, who was an interlocutor with him in what they call the Great Debate, ended up being basically punch drunk when he presented him the transcendental argument for the existence of God. He was punch drunk. He was basically stunned because it's somewhat of a nonsensical argument. Now, I'm not saying that it doesn't have any merits to it, but I'm just saying it was sufficiently scholastic and intellectual, and the language was all worked out because, this was coming from a certain kind of corner of Christendom, or Christianity, I should say. Evangelicalism is a better word.
It was also relatively very new, kind of, the whole argument, the transcendental argument, was really new in a very small niche of the theological world. So he could not have possibly known how to approach that at all.
So, Jay Witt, is that what you were talking about when you said you were listening to these atheists, their arguments were cutting through, you were coming up with responses, but you felt like your responses would be dishonest?
There you go. Yeah, okay. You've pretty much summed it up. So basically, I kind of took you guys on quite a circuitous route there, but I just want you to see that I could have continued going down the line that I was going and been able to use arguments. I could have been in people's YouTube comments doing to them what some of you guys are doing to us, and thinking, stuff like, what's the basis for your usage of the word evil and so on. I mean, this is a consistent thing that I was using back in the day. So it's not like I'm not privy to that argument, but it was dishonest. It was dishonest because, well, let's cut to the chase. For instance, I'm going to quote a little from the book A Reason for God by Tim Keller, that is. I read that book. I had bought and purchased that book and read it. And at one point, he's essentially, it's a popular level presentation of presuppositional apologetics is what that book was.
Okay.
And that's why it's like A Reason for God. And Keller is sufficiently cosmopolitan and urbane, and he knows how to at some point he brings to the reader, wow, this is great. one shouldn't congratulate themselves, but this is a great illustration of the point. He brings to the reader to a point in the book where he's like, he's basically thinking of your typical agnostic / atheist New Yorker. And he's saying, you don't want to adopt a kind of worldview that relativizes, this is a paraphrase, the napalming of babies. Now, that's a fantastic argument for one, because at least in the world that we live in, it's almost universally frowned upon to murder infants. Infanticide is, talking about the biblical times, that's a whole other thing. Like, the imprecatory psalms and stuff. But in our current day, napalming babies is almost universally frowned upon. All right. So, I recognize that our Bible relativizes the murder of babies. Mm-hmm. In short, it's not always bad to commit infanticide in the Bible. How do I know this? You go to the book of Joshua and other, the great conquest of Israel. They are. I even commented on one of our videos. I mentioned one passage where he tells them not to kill the trees. It's not like the trees are men. In other words, it's not like the trees are sentient. So don't kill the trees. But he does instruct them in the same passage to wipe out all the babies, etc. And I mentioned that as what I consider to be a capricious edict. That is, it's somewhat arbitrary. You're going to save trees, but because they're innocent, but the babies, no. You see what I'm saying? So it's when I started seeing that actually the Bible does relativize the killing of infants. Maybe not napalming, because they weren't napalming in that day, but it does relativize infanticide, and there's no way around it. It relativizes.
But then you were, as an apologist, or just even as an evangelical Christian, you felt compelled to come up with a defense for the indefensible. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah.
Either come up with a defense for the indefensible or admit that it's indefensible.
Yeah, well, just one second.
I guess I'm trying to nail down to where you would begin to feel like you'd be being dishonest.
Well, so I presented it there. So I want the listener to fully understand what I'm saying. I had a ready-made presuppositionalist argument for a person. At the same time, I knew the Bible well enough to know that the view I held did the exact same thing that I was telling other people. They didn't want to have a view that forced them to do that. You see? So I don't know if I said that well. I was commending the worldview of the Bible as an alternative to the relativizing of the napalming of babies coming from an agnostic or atheist. But I also understood, because I knew the Bible quite well, that the Bible relativizes infanticide.
So I think I can sum it up. What you're saying is what Keller was trying to get people to do was have a moral system that didn't lead to relativism, such that you could relativize something like the killing of babies. Yes. Meanwhile, preaching from a Bible that did just that.
Yeah, and it was an emotional appeal. Because if you think in Keller's, the amount of things he could have illustrated, why did he go to baby? Because it's almost universally abominated or abhorred in our culture. So he goes to that, and he's, which is interesting, because that same universal abhorrence of that act, indeed, that gaze can be applied to the Bible. You see what I'm saying? And so as the person who's working on being an apt apologist, I could see that if my interlocutor was familiar enough with the scripture, they could turn that on me. And that's where the honesty piece comes into play. Because
you
could
go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm listening.
No, finish that up, because I'm going to use that to springboard somewhere else.
Because you could dishonestly continue going ahead with that, just knowing that probably somewhere in the 90 percentile or 80% of the people that you encounter won't be familiar enough with the text to make an adequate challenge to that proposition. But I knew it. So that's why I say it's an honesty thing, because if I know this, and if I can't come up with a good answer for it, then I need to either shift my position or I need to stop making that argument. That's why it's a matter of honesty. Gotcha. It's not to say that the theist or the Christian is wrong. It's just saying that that's a bad argument for Christianity. You see what I'm saying? 'Cause
Gotcha.
that's an important distinction.
So I've had my own experiences, and Albert, I'd like you to be thinking if you could relate to any of this. I've had my own experiences with struggling with honesty. Mine's came in the form, so like I've mentioned that it was 2014 when I sort of started catching the hint that the evangelical world was going to have to start taking evolution serious. And that pushed me to kind of have to rethink Genesis, rethink its connection to the New Testament, rethink Jesus' mention of the first couple, rethink Paul's use of Romans 5.
Right.
And I didn't like the answers I was getting, even in my head as I was trying to work through. So I just kept shutting down those thought processes. But then, several years after graduating from seminary, when I wasn't really paying attention to those thoughts, I was working in the secular world, teaching at a high school, and I had coworkers, and I had several. One of them was a Jewish man, another was a white guy from the suburbs of Philly, but they both taught in the inner city, and both of them at different times were asking me, basically, almost not begging, but almost like, I'm open for what you got. I don't know if I'm atheist. I want to be able to believe in God. I'm just looking for a good reason. Give me what you got. And I remember feeling, this was years before my deconversion. Years before I had even started doing any of the work of deconstruction. This was 2016, 2017. And they're looking at me like I'm an open book. I'm not saying I'm going to believe everything you say, but if you got something, give it to me. And I'm like, man, the old apologist Brady, the old evangelist Brady, he would dive in right now. Like you've been strategizing your whole life to create these kinds of moments. Go get them. And I remember within myself thinking, but I know that the evangelical world is right now in secret conclaves, meeting and deciding about how they're going to reconcile Genesis with evolution. Here I am out in the secular workforce talking to my coworker, and I've got to start talking to them about Adam and Eve, knowing that the group that I come from, the Christian world that I come from, is right now rethinking these things. And I just remember feeling like I could just go and give this person the traditional old gospel in Romans 5 and, the whole not. But I said, that just feels dishonest because I know. Not that I even thought evolution was true at that point. I just knew we're not standing on it like we used to. And I don't even know where I would stand. How am I going to tell this to someone else? And I remember it made me much, much less vocal. I stopped preaching at that point. I said, I can't preach this because even though I don't know all I need to know, I feel like it would be dishonest. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I had to just stop preaching.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think my story is a little different. Obviously, I'm not an educator. I'm not, I didn't go to seminary, and I think the struggle that you had is very unique in that, with that context in mind. But for me, I think it was as a layman or armchair, person who's into theology. It was a little easier for me to put on the shelf to really, but the thing is, I realized after the fact that when you look back on these things, I think part of the reason why seminaries have harmonization courses, why those things have to become resolved in some manner or form, doesn't necessarily mean it's false, but I think it's indicative of the fact that there is a real problem going on with this quest to try and bring that harmony where it really doesn't exist. So, to me, when I hear your story, Brady, I'm hearing, you're in a place where you have to speak from some level of conviction, and if you can't do that for, something as fundamental as, trying to harmonize evolution with the biblical text and things like that, that's a real problem. For me, I remember thinking, here's the folly of my thinking back then, was thinking that, oh, well, you have a bunch of people out there, Warfield being, one of my favorites at the time, as well as other, N.T. Wright and whatever you might think of N.T. Wright, but,
you could put C.S. Lewis in the same category.
C.S. Lewis in the same category. Mm-hmm. You make all these exceptions. You're like, oh, there's these brilliant people, apologists out there, or other Christians who seem to be okay with this, or have some kind of leeway here or there. But I don't think I wanted to commit any time to being in that discomfort. You know what I mean? So that was that was my folly. Like I chose to ignore it, and I was comfortable choosing to ignore it at some point. For a while, yeah.
You might have committed a different intellectual crime than the one that I was flirting with.
Right, correct.
You ignored it, whereas I struggled. I don't think I was ever tempted. And this is, you guys are probably going to be shocked when you see how I edit this all together, because all of this was really just a long on ramp to where I was trying to get us to begin talking about this. There was a temptation to just become a liberal Christian. Like I could have just embraced liberalism and said, okay, so you mean we don't believe that anymore, we don't believe that anymore, we don't believe that anymore, but we still believe the gospel? Okay, I'll try to get there. But I felt like I would be being dishonest. And then someone, when I deconverted, put out my video, there was all this discussion on Facebook. When people began to get a hint of the things that was making me question the textual criticism issues and scientific issues and all that, one person asked, she said, Brady, do you think it would be a good idea, and I'll throw this out there to you guys, remember we're still just on ramping, because I'm gonna flip the script in a second, but they asked this question: do you think that maybe Christians should expose new believers or even would-be believers to some of these issues early on, so that people don't get 5, 10, 15, 20 years into the faith and then find out, oh, there's 5 views on that, and do you think we should do that? That way they don't run the risk of falling away like I did. And I said, that's a good question, but I almost feel like if you did that, you almost would be almost like catfishing people. Like you sell them this. I'm sorry. What she's trying to prevent is this catfishing of people.
Right.
She's trying to prevent this. There are things that we know, but we're not going to say that just yet. We got to get you in the door first. We got to get you comfortable first. We got to get you married to a Christian spouse first. We got to get you in a ministry first, maybe a few different ministries. We got to get you so invested before we show you what's really going on here. Mm-hmm. And she's like, what if we did the reverse? What if we showed them what's really going on first? My question that I hope will open the floor up to you guys is, do you think you would have believed, and do you think it's a good idea to present the faith that way, with all the warts, with all the inaccuracies and inconsistencies and all the everything exposed? Do you think that would be a good way to maybe save what's happening to Christianity, and would that have worked on you?
I honestly think that brings to mind that John 6 passage where Jesus thins his crowd out intentionally. Mm-hmm. I'll throw this in for good measure. Like, don't get mad at Brady. In fact, y'all should be using these videos to train your Christians, the new members class. You should just expose them to this stuff. I mean, I would imagine that like Christ had this huge following. At one passage, they even suggested they were following him because of the food, just other motives that weren't pure. And it was his intention to throw out things to thin the crowd intentionally.
The hard sayings.
In John 6, he talks about almost cannibalistic type. Of course, they interpreted it that way.
Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no part of me.
Yeah, and he thins the crowd intentionally. So there are a lot of people who feel like what you're doing is you're pulling people out, you're a deceiver. But like, in John 10, Christ is like, nobody can pluck them out of my hand. So that actually, not to take this to do a detour, but you can't have it both ways. You can't have this perseverance / preservation of the saints by the Holy Spirit, and Brady is to be blamed for for making people defect. Because if he's helping people, he's actually helping the church. This is what he's doing as a service. It's one of the ways that he's getting the chaff out. But I honestly think exposure to full orbed, basically biblical criticism is a service for Christians, because maybe
it's a service for Christians, but is it a service to new Christians?
Well, yeah, I mean, honestly, you shouldn't be trying to, like, you shouldn't be doing a bait and switch with people. That's just dishonest. So if what you're doing is in the name of, like, don't bring me in to Christianity with these literal stories, and then when I get in, then be like, I'm an evolutionary theist. Like, let me know what the deal is at the door, so then I'm like, all right, well, basically this is not much different than a Greek myth or something else. Then I can weigh it with its peers. I can look at it with its peers. But by you acting like this book is very much unique and different than other kinds of stories that are similar to it, you're causing your audience to think that that's one of the reasons they should take it seriously. Not to say they shouldn't take it seriously. Understand, they might want to take it seriously, but that shouldn't be one of the reasons that they're setting it aside as being something that should be taken. It's quite, even in, I'm just thinking, go ahead.
Well, yeah, so the second part of the question, I want Albert to chime in. Maybe, Albert, you can start the second part of the question is, so let's say people take the advice Jay Witt is giving, like we're going to from the door now show people that, hey, maybe what Genesis was doing was offering a polemic to the nations around them.
Right.
Your God had,
that was an assumption I had. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So if the biblical story was presented like that to you from the get-go, as opposed to, hey, let me tell you about how God created the world in 6 days, and only God was around at that time, so of course only God will know how it happened. So what he says must go. Instead of presenting it to you like that, if it was presented to you the way that the liberals would present it, or even the progressive Christians who are now saying these newfound things, would you have believed? Would it have been as powerful? Would it have grabbed you the same way?
I think it would have grabbed me more. It would have grabbed me more in some ways, engaged with me, with my interests in terms of having some kind of plurality of interpretation, given a little bit. Would it have caused me to leave the faith? Probably no.
Well, not leave the faith, because we're getting in the door.
We're not even talking about that.
Would it have gotten you in the door if the story was much more mundane, much more pedestrian? The way that people are now starting to, present it.
Yeah. I probably. It's hard to say because I grew up in the church, right? But I'll just try to answer that, because I feel like every time I've heard, even the way Bart Ehrman would talk about, things, not even from a textual critic standpoint, but just trying to lay out kind of the historical nature of, how the Bible came to be, and putting more of that human spin to it. Yeah, it would be a lot more fascinating, for sure. Now, I think would that lead you to at some point, profess Christ as your Savior and you kind of get baptized? That's another story entirely. So obviously I think that's what Christian churches are wary of, right? That's not what they want. Fervor, they want zeal. When that doesn't really inspire zeal when you talk about the realities of
that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
So how about you, Jay Witt? Do you think if the presentation had come to you in a much more tamed, realistic. Like, oh, I can get that's what the scripture's doing, because that other stuff, talking snakes and talking dung, that was a little bit much.
Yeah, I
If
mean,
it,
I wouldn't have spent more time with it than I spent with any Greek myths or any other
Yeah.
kind of mythology. More than likely, I would have just gone on with my life. I mean, just think about how much time the average American, let's say, or I don't know how much of an international audience we have, but how much time your average human being that's on the planet right now spends entertaining ancient myths. Just of any sort, Greek mythology. I mean, now it's interesting. I have, since I left the faith, gotten into just the Greek myths, but I engage with it like literature and storytelling
Right.
more, and not for anything profound. Actually, it's interesting. Myths can be engaged with as something profound about human nature, but it's a different kind of thing. It's not making.
you don't
it's not,
take it as divine revelation.
No, not at all, and it's not telling you how you're to behave. It's more describing human behavior than it is telling you what to do.
So
It's
for the
kind of-
person that's watching, I guess one of the things you could talk about in the comments is, let's just say, 15, 10, 20 years from now, the Bible has kind of come down from this lofty level of everything in it is divinely inspired, and the things that the miraculous things that are taken so literal today are more taken as this was an ancient people's attempt to paint their God in a more favorable light, or inspire their people to follow the right God. Let's just say that happens. Do you think that Christianity could have the same kind of impact as Albert said? Would it inspire the kind of awe and devotion? And if that's the route it's going, because I think that this is sort of what I did. Just to be honest, I saw the trend. I saw what was happening, and I said, "Oh wait, that's where this is going. It's probably going to take us a long time to get there, but that's where this is going." I jumped overboard. I said, "Nope, I'm not going down with that ship. I see where this is headed."
Hey, Jonah,
I saw where it was going, and I said, I'm not taking that ride. And I'll watch from the pier, but I'm not sinking on that ship. But I don't know. I guess that's the thing. You talk about presenting it as one thing to get you in the door, and then tell you it's something else. That sort of does have this feeling of being catfish. Now, here's what I want to do. I'm going to tell an embarrassing story, I guess. But then I want to compare it to the way that God is presented. This is why I call this CatFishers of Men. So years ago, I started doing online dating. I was trying to find my wife, and I signed up for a Christian dating service. Saw this sister's profile, cute, read her bio. Oh, she's on point. I start kicking it with her. We get on the phone. She's got a nice, soft, sweet voice. She's in New York. I'm in Philly. That's 2 hours away. So we start planning like, yo, this is going so well. We should get face to face. And I think this was so long ago. It was like even before like webcams were like really the thing. Let's get face to face. All right, I'm gonna come to New York this Saturday. Planned it. Got my bus ticket. Saturday comes. Before I leave the house, she calls. Oh, I can't do it today. Da 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 da. Oh, bet. And this is embarrassing. That happened about 5 more times, where we were planning to get together, and every single time she had some kind of excuse. And I'm like, yo, what's going on? Like, this ain't right. And finally I said, yo, I can't do this. It's over. It's over. And I hung up, like, yo, I'm not doing this. She finally called back and said, I got to be honest with you. That picture that was in my profile, that's not really me. And then she just started talking about why she used a different picture. She sent me the real picture. And I was just like, I mean, the real picture wasn't bad. It just wasn't the same girl. It just was like, that ain't what I have my heart set on or whatever. But she got me all invested off of one idea, and spent about 2 months never really showing me what was like. I can't really show you me. You can't come meet me. I've got all these reasons why you can't come. I said at some point, go back to what we've been talking about. At some point, how do you as the Christian not feel like you're participating in an elaborate catfish scheme where you're telling people God is one thing, you're telling people God has done some things, you're using this very attractive supernatural bait to get them in the door, but you know at some point you're going to have to tell them, well, not really, well, not so much. And when they begin to ask, hey, the Bible says that those who believe would be able to do these things. And well, I know that's what the profile said, but we don't really get into that so much. We think about God's profile. You have all these things. Why doesn't he do supernatural? This is the thing. I used to say, tell me if you guys ever said anything like this. Oh, yeah, the miracles in the Bible, those happen in specific time periods. It was Moses and Joshua, Elijah and the prophets, and Jesus and the disciples. And God was only doing the big miracles then because he was what did we say? He was validating messengers of a new message. Let my people go, or with Elijah and the prophets, or Jesus and the disciples. It was a new message, a new shift in God's program, so he had to validate the messengers. And because God's not validating the messengers right now, he's not doing any miracles. Like, there's all these reasons why.
Well, let's pause there if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Based on what we were saying last podcast, so it is validation of the message when you perform a sign?
In the Bible, at those certain times.
No, I mean, I know, but I'm just saying, I just want people to really take note of what the whole argument actually implies.
Right.
It actually implies that people do, like, if you're presenting signs and wonders along with a message, and then you tell people don't believe because of signs and wonders, then why are you giving signs and wonders? Just think about that. Right. That's it. I just wanted to say that.
But here's the nuance was, it wasn't he was validating the message, he was validating the messengers.
Okay, either way. I mean, it's like, so he's validating the messenger. So is he only, or is it that we're saying remarkable things? Okay, this is almost like applying a certain kind of logic to it. It's far easier to claim that something miraculous happened in the past than it is to produce something miraculous in the present. So if you can say all of these things happened previously, for sure, and they were attestations to the messengers, the apostolic message. And when I say apostolic, I'm not even just saying the apostles, and I'm saying people who were sent. So that it verified, it attested to the veracity of what they were saying. But you're not granting your present audience that same sort. You're not saying, okay, it would function the same way for your present audience. It only functions, just like you said before, it's written. So the words function that way for your contemporary audience. For the past audience, there was the actual deed. Yeah. Now, is it easier for it to just be said that happened and it didn't happen, or is it easier for it to actually have happened, and then just for some reason it doesn't? And another thing is there's this dichotomy between the two, almost like you can't have the words and the act in the miracles simultaneously, even though you had them in the past. You had them simultaneously,
Well, so that's part of the catfish, though. That's part of the you have to say things that explain why you can't get what's being advertised, and you have to keep coming up with things to say to explain all the other things that. So
But it's a mutually exclusive thing. It's an unnecessarily mutually exclusive nature to it, because it's not necessary.
It is necessary for the catfish.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
You said exactly.
Right.
Now, if you're in, but you see, the whole term catfishing here is implying that this is, there's a bit of dishonesty going on here.
Exactly. Well, that's what I'm basically challenging listeners, viewers, to show us how it's not. Show us how it's not that, because we're bringing up.
Yeah, please get in the comments I'd love to. I'd love to see some example of how that makes some sort of sense.
But think about this. You have a dating profile, right? One of the things that makes a dating profile believable, you gotta ask certain questions. Like, if you start trying to meet someone, especially in this day and age, right? You're gonna ask them, like, why are you single in the first place? Like, are you sure you're free? Are you sure you're not married? Why are you single? And one of the things that people will do is they'll always have stories about their ex, and it's always their ex's fault. And when you think about what's happening with the God of the Bible, he's got several exes, and it's always their fault. Like, you've got Satan, who was an angelic being, who, for whatever reason, this angelic being, he wasn't feeling me, so he left. And you got Adam and Eve, and for whatever reason, I showed myself to them, and they wasn't feeling me. It's their fault. They left. It's never the person's fault. It's always the ex's fault.
But
But
somehow God is still sovereign in all of that.
God is still
I'll never
sovereign
forget.
and still single.
I'll never forget. This is ridiculous.
He's
I'll
still
never
available.
I'll never forget Carson, because any in-depth study of these matters, you start realizing that the ultimate culprit is the creator. Like, no.
you're reading it wrong.
I'm going somewhere, and it's going to be quick too. When you start doing the analysis, now, obviously from a certain perspective, if you see God as sovereign, which is almost hard to get around in the Bible, you start doing these, you start saying, okay, where does the evil come from? I remember Piper saying, where does an evil impulse arise? I remember he said that particular phrase in a sermon talking about Adam and Eve. He's like, if they were created good and so forth, where does this inclination to do evil, he used those words, where does this evil inclination arise? And he gave the I don't know. There's a whole field of theology called theodicy that deals with the problem of evil in a world that God himself, who's supposed to be the good, created, and no variance and no shadow of turning is in him, and no evil can proceed from him. And I remember reading in D.A. Carson's book, The Gagging of God, he talked about how God stands asymmetrically behind both good and evil. And it was interesting because the idea was he doesn't work it out logically. He's just saying that he's sovereignly behind both good and evil, but he stands asymmetrically behind them, and he stands behind them in such a way where the good can be attributed to him and the evil cannot. And that was the end of the argument. He doesn't tell you how the evil. He never tells you how, and nobody can. They just tell you that this is the case. He's behind both of them.
Yeah.
The evil can't be attributed to him.
But I take this back to, this is the whole idea. Like, because I'm still single and dating, I hear these kind of things, and people even ask me, like, when you ask somebody why you're single, one of the things that the person asking wants to know is, are you going to have the humility to admit that you're part of the reason? Or are you going to put it all on your exes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And when you read the Bible's presentation of God, it's always the exes. It's always God's exes. It's Satan, it's Adam and Eve, it's Israel.
Well, he's asymmetrically. He's asymmetrically behind the evil. Like, it's the evil and the good. The good can be, you can blame him for the good. The evil is your fault. Because it's a necessary part of his ontology, his being, that he not be able to have any evil attributed to him.
Right.
So that it necessarily falls on the created order, on you, on Satan, whatever else, and that's just one of the ways, So I mean, if you want the glories of substitutionary atonement, you got to accept the scheme, man. That's where we end at the end of the day.
Al, you about to say? Al, you about to say something?
No, I'm still thinking, but I just, it's an interesting analogy to all this. I mean, obviously the Christian, I'm anticipating, would say, well, it's God is God, I am not, right? That's the
Romans 9, basically.
Romans 9. Romans 9 uses that. But the fact that we don't have, I don't. I'm processing this.
So I'm gonna help you process, because
Sure.
For the time we got left, I want to run through 3 areas where I believe the signs of the catfish show up, and the Christian is implicit in it. not just implicit, complicit in it. All right. So I'm probably gonna get fried for this one, but why is it? Why is it?
There's a whole lot of looking up.
Yeah, because I'm trying to find a way to couch it that doesn't get me strung up, but I don't know if there is. But no, so I think about this. Somebody in one of our comments said, they said, "Are you ever going to talk about how passages like Hebrews, forsake not the assembling of yourselves together, how that often is used?" And I said, yeah, we're probably going to get to that at some point. I think it comes in here. But here's how I want to tie it in. The church is often referred to as the body of Christ. I think that is more true now than I ever thought it was. The church is the body of Christ, so much so, or precisely because were it not for the church, there would be no body of Christ. Not because he's ascended, because he's deceased if he ever existed. If Jesus is going to do anything, you are literally going to have to be his hands. You are literally going to have to be the arms that console the person who's hurting. You know, we literally have to answer one another's prayers. If you ever thought about this, like, why is it that when someone doesn't show up in church, or when someone doesn't stay around Christians, the presence of God seems to fade with the fading of the body? I'll never forget, I worked at a ministry called Teen Haven in Philadelphia, where I used to drive a van around the city and pick up teens, bring them back to a building, do Bible study. Every other weekend, I would take the teens about 2 hours away from Philly out to a camp. This was while I was in seminary. I was taking 12 credits in seminary, Hebrew and Greek and all that, writing City of Allegory, a book, and working 40 hours a week with these teens, driving out to camp every other week. But this ministry had been around for like 40 years. Like, there have been generations that had come through this ministry. But it was so interesting that I'm working with these teens week in and week out, but there was no church involvement. And I remember working with these teens, and I'm giving them the gospel week in and week out.
So they call para-church organization, right?
It was a para-church, organization. So there was no church involvement, which means there was no body of Christ. There was no people around to help mold them other than me and the other camp counselors and the, whatever. But in terms of who they did life with, they did life with people in their neighborhood and people in their schools. These teens were not socialized in Christian settings, so they almost were not Christianized, even if they heard the gospel and embraced it. Now, somebody could say, well, your preaching must have been lame. But I guarantee you, anybody who knows Teen Haven, anybody who sees us, who work with me at Teen Haven, they know how much I dug in, how much I poured out. This was in my fervent days. They got some of my best preaching and teaching. But minus the body of Christ, minus the people around to help socialize them in Christian ways, that ministry, Teen Haven, though it's been around for 40 plus years, has had the hardest time making lifelong disciples of people. And I only say that to say there is something to this idea of forsake not the assembly. But that says to me, if God is, I'm not filling in the blank with anything, if God is, period, if he exists, and if God is powerful enough to change a life and reshape a person, isn't it a little suspicious that can hardly ever happen outside of what we call the means of grace? These means of grace, what does it say that the all-powerful God of creation needs humanity as much as he seems to need humanity.
Hmm. That brings to mind a thought I had when I was deconverting, which was one of the tenets of Calvinism is unconditional. It's in Tulip. It's the U in Tulip is unconditional election, and that means that is to say that there is no condition that election is made of the creature of believers apart from any consideration of a condition being met in them. And there is no particular attribute, nothing within them. In other words, this is a way. These are the doctrines of grace. This is a way to say that this is totally of grace, God's favor, right? So when you look at the demographics of church, there's a disproportionate amount of women in churches to men. This is a fact. More women go to church than men. And so the thought is, now, you might have to put your thinking caps on, maybe you don't. If you have an unconditional election, why would it be that more women end up going to church than men? It would seem that, based on the statistics, that one of the conditions for, if the local church, what he said, the means of grace is the local church, if that's the way God saves people, is through this vehicle, why would there consistently be more women in there? It would seem that that's one of the conditions that election is being made on the basis of. You have people regularly talking about men wanting to stay home and play and watch football and so forth. I mean, that's just a going joke in church. I'll never forget, even at another church I went to, the minister would consistently mention that, you'll be able to get to your football some other time. There's just this disinterested mass of men, but you have a lot of women in these churches. Okay, so that's probably overstated, but just like, and coupled with that was the thought, well, if that is the case, maybe the thing that's drawing women to church is something, it has something to do with maybe biology or sociology, but maybe it's not. It just got me thinking. I don't know. You can double back on this, Brady, but it got me thinking along those same lines. It was like, there seems to be something more naturalistic going on here than something supernaturalistic or something metaphysical happening. It seems that women are drawn to the institution of church because it's meeting something that is peculiar to women and not to men as much. You see what I'm saying? Does that make some sense, you guys?
Yeah. Thoughts on that, Albert?
Yeah. This is kind of it's a very interesting point you're bringing out, and it's worth a kind of deep dive, I think, because what the things that I'm thinking about are, the Roman Catholic Church as an institution, right? If you date back to the medieval times and you look at the amount of ritual, the amount of engagement that the normal commoner has with the church was a lot higher than actually what we have today. Mass was performed every day. People went through the catechism, learning the catechisms and etc. And then you look at the Protestant Reformation, and then you talk about the means of grace, how the reformers tried to boil it down to essentially the preaching of the gospel and the partaking of the body and blood of Christ, right?
Sacraments.
The sacraments. So they pushed out all of that noise, right? All of that other extra rituals that were in play.
High church type
correct.
Stuff.
Yeah. And then, but this is all, once again, it's all an engineering of a type that pulls people in, but also keeps you in, right? This constant revisiting, this constant engagement with the ecclesiastical rituals, in place. So now we come to the modern times, and I feel like, because we have in the evangelical world and all that stuff, like they don't actually put a great emphasis on the means of grace, in a sense. They're not really preaching the gospel every Sunday. They're not necessarily having communion. So what do? They create programs. They create activities. They create modern things that we associate with communing together. But it's, once again, what it requires a lot of money. It requires a lot of manpower. There's a lot of, I think what you're talking about, Brady, is that social aspect, right? It's how things are engineered in a practical manner, in a way that's much more simple in terms of, pastors need to get paid.
Well, let's hold off on that one. Yeah, because
okay.
that'll come up in a second. But
Right,
I think there's part of the social aspect where the social sort of gets credit for being the spiritual.
Right.
So think about how many people's, just even when it comes to what the church does for helping people have community, helping people with meeting spouses, helping people with staying in marriages, helping people with raising kids, helping people with, it kind of does get into the financial when you begin to think about answering each other's prayers. Like there's a network of people who answer one another's prayers in churches. That if you disconnect yourself from that local body,
you lose that support.
You lose that support, and in a very organic way. Now you don't have a group of people who know what you're praying for. So who's going to answer your prayers? And I know there are people who will say, "Well, there are times when I prayed and nobody knew, and God still sent the other." Okay, you have those hits, but then you got all the misses of times where unless you let somebody know what your needs were, you can pray all you want. Those needs ain't getting met. Those needs ain't getting met. Somebody's got to know what you're praying about, and the words got to spread, and someone's got to find out, oh, there's a need. Oh, so-and-so can meet that need. Like, the body of Christ is very much that. Even if there were no spiritual impetus behind it, it literally does become a physical, need-meeting, soul-stirring experience, such that you feel like you're meeting with this person whose profile you've been reading about in the Bible all week. You've got to go to the place where the body can kind of help you get the sense that he really has met with us. And without that, you don't have it.
And you really get the sense that rather than it being this being the work of God, that it's actually the work of men. And even when you think of what I was saying about the disproportionate amount of women, and you can clearly see that churches that, the flip side is you see certain churches where there are a lot of men, and a lot of times that's highlighted. Like they'll be like, yeah, like a lot of guys are there, and it's seen as superlative that there's a lot of guys, but it usually has something to do, you can usually trace it to very naturalistic things. Like, they have I think of Driscoll was known for attracting a lot of young men to his, and you could, it had nothing to do with anything metaphysical at all. You could just see the way he ran in his spot. He ran it like this, red pill type dude or something. You know what I mean? Like, and you could see that was what was attracting. So it's like when you start looking at these things and you see what Brady's talking about, and you see what I'm talking about, and you start looking at it, then the dynamic, you're like, this is a social organization. This is it's functioning the way you would expect anything that doesn't have a supernatural input. Like we don't need to plug it into the wall to make it function. Like to use an electrical analogy, it's just like a purely mechanical apparatus. You understand what I'm saying?
Well, and I think during COVID, what a lot of people experienced was I was able to not be in that place and not a whole lot changed. I had several people tell me, like, why does it feel like God is back where I left him before the church stopped meeting?
That's an interesting comment.
Yeah, these were Christians who were kind of like, I feel like I might be deconverting or deconstructing, but this was like a year and a half into COVID. They said, I feel like we haven't been meeting, and I feel like God is back where I left him.
That brings you full circle.
Yeah.
That brings you to that quote from the Bible: "Don't forsake the." Because the people who engineered this religion, they knew that was an important piece of the puzzle. I remember Reformed people saying, "We need to be reminded of the gospel every week." Why? Like, because you'll forget, and essentially, and you'll get on with your life.
Or you not necessarily you'll forget, but it's almost like
no, you know what I'm saying.
No, but I want to reword it. It's not necessarily you'll forget as much as it is it'll wear off.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean.
Can you imagine?
When I'm saying,
yeah, I'm just trying to help the listener out.
The strength of it. Strength of it.
Yeah. Can you imagine, like, what does it say about your anointing if it wears off?
Mm-hmm.
You know?
It dissipates.
Right.
It dissipates.
Right.
If
Ichabod. If the glory departs, like, what does it say about this omnipresence? How can omnipresence depart?
Yeah. I mean, I think that was an important, and it's interesting that Christians, when they try to walk through, particularly like your deconversions, I've heard and read comments where it seemed like it was, he was sort of disconnected, so to speak.
Yeah.
I mean, they would say that about almost every believer who leaves. They'll say the person was. And what are you admitting?
Hold on, for the person who doesn't understand what Jay Wood is saying. There are people who were looking at my deconversion, trying to figure out the reason why. Even people in the rap group that I was a part of, the Christian rap group, they said, "Yeah, Brady."
Oh, they saw that.
Well, John Wells, he said this in the interview he did with Vocab Malone. We didn't talk about it when we critiqued his interview, but there's a part where he says those years after Cross Movement, 2014 or 15, all that time. I forget the word they used. Oh, the word was, here's what they'll say: Brady was isolated. He was isolated. And think about this, y'all. If I was isolated and it allowed me to deconvert, think about what being insulated does to the believer.
Right.
You almost need to remain insulated to remain a believer, because you need people around to reinforce your spiritual beliefs.
Well, let's push back. Let's push back on that idea a little.
Okay.
From their side.
Mm-hmm.
So they say he ordains the end and the means.
Mm-hmm.
The local gathering is a means of grace.
Mm-hmm.
What say you?
Yeah, I could see someone saying that, but at the same time, it's very difficult, and this is one of my issues. It's very difficult to distinguish your means of grace from happenstance, your means of grace from coincidence, your means of grace from, like you said a minute ago, Jay Witt, very natural things that can be explained very naturalistically. So I understand these are the means. It's almost like the person who says, "Oh yeah, maybe God didn't directly create man from the dust. Maybe He used evolution." Okay, the second you introduce a naturalistic explanation but put God behind it, how do I know God was behind it and it's not just a naturalistic thing? So if you make these naturalistic things the secondary cause, but God is still the primary cause, how do I know that we can't remove this idea of the primary cause and still be getting what you're saying is a secondary cause? So remove the Holy Spirit and still have me going. So I did this. Even while my faith was wavering and suffering, I still kept going to church. And I remember sitting in church saying, everything inside me has changed. Nothing in my environment has changed. And no one in the environment can even tell anything inside me has changed. So is it really a primary cause, just using a secondary means? Or is there really no primary, and this is really all there is? And the church is needed to insulate the believer, to help us keep feeling like prayers are being answered, help us keep feeling like the reality that the Bible talks about is the reality. Because if I get too far outside of that, what's that psalm? Is it Psalm 1? That walk not in the ways of the, don't sit in the seat of the scorner, don't. Why? Because if you spend too much time in their world, you might realize that their world is the real world. No, spend.
Well, everything you're describing right now is the way prayer itself is set up, because you have what they call God's the creative will, and his prescriptive will, right? And the Christian has his desires. And it's said that only as much as the Christian's desires align with his articulated desires in prayer align with both his prescribed will, and his decretive will it occur. So there's a sense in which after you run it through those two checks, you could almost say, like, what's the whole point in even praying?
You're basically saying whatever happens is God's will.
Whatever happens is God's will, and you almost, and now some people will say, well, he's using your, but then you have to ask yourself,
he's using your what?
He's using your prayer as a means to the end of answering your prayer, but then you have to ask yourself about how terribly and terrifically inefficient that is. Because when you really think about it, you have this idea, this notion. Now, they would often tell Christians, they'd be like, so it gives God a way out, no matter what. At the end of the day, if something happens that you pray for, then he gets the credit. If it doesn't happen, you say, well, it either didn't align with his prescribed will or his decretive will. Well, that's just another way of saying, like, he's going to make what happens, whatever he wants to make happen. And it almost, it seems, you understand what I mean?
Yeah. I think you said this a while ago. Give him the credit for the good. Don't fault him for the bad.
There you go. Yeah, that's probably as efficiently as it could be said.
Yeah. So that's just, to me, one way. I think if I would love to hear the comments from the believers. What happens if you stop insulating yourself with other people that reinforce your worldview? What happens? Does the need for the body say anything about whether or not there really is a person, a divine person, behind this quote unquote body? Or are you part of an elaborate catfish? Are you helping to make it look like everything the biblical authors said is the case? And if you stopped helping, what would happen?
We would happen.
What do you mean? Oh, they become us.
They become us. You know, Ichabod.
Not me. I was still in the body, and then
What do you mean?
Yeah.
No, I was still attending church until I had that realization. So, obviously exceptions, right? But but you're right. Largely from a kind of organizational and top-down perspective, that commingling, that coming together has to happen. So, we saw it really evident during the pandemic when churches, when it were in totally against the the lockdown measure and things like that. So it was a threat to everything, actually. Right?
You must be mutually encouraged,
right,
by one another's faith, right? That's biblical language there. Mutually encouraged by one another's faith.
I think there's another part of this that qualifies as something akin to a catfish. Often, especially on Facebook, people will ask me, if you're saying that the biblical authors, the gospel writers, even Paul and them, like, if they didn't see the resurrected Jesus, or if these things didn't happen, why would they write about it? What would they have to gain from it? Like, no one does this, just for the fun of it. They're giving up their lives. They're all that. We can talk about that some other time, whether or not they gave their lives for this. That's a whole other discussion. But what would they have to gain from it? And so, at one point, I just posted this passage, Acts chapter 4, verse 32, and you can just tell me if you think this has anything akin to catfishiness. What would they have to gain from it? Acts chapter 4, verse 32. Now the full number of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one said that any of the things that belonged to him was his own, but they had everything in common. And with great power the apostles were giving their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as were owners of lands or houses sold them and bought the proceeds of what was sold and laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had need. Now, I'm just going to say this. Am I saying that the apostles were fleecing the flock? I'm not saying that. But for the person who says, what would they have had to gain from saying these things if they were not true? Acts is
I already see this. I already know where you're going with this, man.
Acts is reporting on something, but think about this. They're writing about something that happened in the past tense. Acts is not somebody who's standing right there while it's happening writing. They're telling you about something that happened in the past tense, something that the readers of this, the person who's receiving this text, may not have any idea or in any way to know if the things they're reading about ever happened, because it's being written about in the past tense. So whoever's receiving this text is saying, oh, word, that's what they were doing? And is that a blueprint for what we should be doing? Okay, so I guess we got to have apostles. Or maybe I am the apostle. And I need to be telling the people under me, like, hey, they was selling everything they had and putting it at the apostles' feet. Why ain't y'all doing that? Regardless of whatever happened in those days, it's very interesting that in our day and age, the church is very much still practicing a large portion of the first part of this passage, not so much the last part of it. The church is very good at helping people feel like you need to be giving. You need to be giving a portion of your income. Very good at that. How well does the church do the other part of that passage? No one in their community had any need. They sold everything they had, lands, houses, whatever, and laid the proceeds at the apostles' feet, and no one had need.
But Brady, a simple reading. I'll never forget hearing a sermon from a Reformed pastor who was alluding to the fact that for one, he immediately felt like he had to say this isn't communism, which is interesting. Like immediately after he read the passage, because it's describing communism essentially. But he was at a very conservative Republican, and this isn't a knock on Republicanism or conservatism. I'm just saying his church, his congregation was very conservative, very, very conservative and Republican. And so he felt like he had to, for whatever reason, he felt like he had to come out and say, this isn't communism. Although what they're describing in some sense is like this is communism. That's a commune.
It's a commune. It's not communism. It's not a government.
Okay.
Practice.
Yeah. I got to make sure.
Yeah.
Let's make that distinction.
But even that, the church is not, like, what church is with that? And I know somebody will probably...
Well, you have some, but they're usually the more cult-like ones. They tend to be the ones where the leader gets everybody's wife and kids and whatever. You know what I mean?
They had everything in common.
They had everything.
Yeah, exactly. But it is interesting. It is interesting that, like, I guess what you're saying is, they're good at taxing your income, essentially, but they're not very good at making sure you have a roof over your head and clothes on your back and food in your stomach.
Or that no one in the community had any need.
Mm-hmm. And I can already hear the rebuttal here. They're going to be like, brother, speak for yourself. You're describing the community you came up. That's why I like to say I'm an ecumenical unbeliever. You know, because people like being very specific. When you come with these critiques, they like getting real specific. Like, your community wasn't that way. Don't speak for other people's. Right. You know, what do you say to that, Brady?
No, I mean, I do think that there are probably churches who would say we're not a cult, but we do make sure no one here has needs. And I would say, amen, that's what's up. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, don't act like there's nothing to be gained.
This thumbnail.
Don't act like there's nothing to be gained from teaching that this is how the body of Christ is supposed to get down. We know that there are very many churches who they gain from this.
They look out for people too. But you're saying that a lot of churches actually do.
I would say the majority of churches don't function that way. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's look at this clip here.
This is hilarious.
This is a oldie but a goodie. This was going around on the internet a couple years ago. Now it's going around on TikTok. So check this out.
Shit getting real in church.
I understand his position. Yeah. I'm getting into the position in front of my face right now.
Yeah. Well, the elephant in the room is this, and that.
Elephant in the room.
Yeah, the elephant in the room is that.
Glad I'm alive.
Okay. Well, we have to deal with the elephant in the room, and the elephant in the
Pastor,
room.
I'm just be honest with you. Look, I'm not going to come up here and give y'all all my money that I make every month. I'm just sorry. I've been fair.
Well, we're not looking for you to give
I put $20 a week. Yeah. And then sometimes I feel good. I have
$20 a week is like giving a dollar.
Can I say something? Is that your 10% of your earnings?
That's my business. That's what it is. You get your 10%. You get your 10%.
I wrote it down what you made.
Look here.
I wrote it what you made.
She wrote what you make, and see, it does not reach.
Well, I got to just find me. I'm not finna let y'all attack me.
Yeah. Well, we're not.
I know robbery, strong arm.
Let me do.
You ain't finna rob me, and I'm agree to it.
Well, let's talk about robbery. In the book of Malachi, it talks about, will a man rob God? He said, yea, ye have robbed me in your tithes and offerings. That's where you rob. That's where robbery happens.
Man, let me tell you something. I really don't even believe in the 10%. Yeah. I'm gonna just be honest with you. I think that was man-made. You feel me? Because back then, when they came up with 10%, ain't nobody had jobs. So where the money come up with 10% at?
Who told you folk didn't have jobs?
What job was? Everybody paying everybody with apples and oranges and bananas.
They had jobs. They had livestock. They had
what black folks you know had livestock?
Don't have to be black.
They had a half a pig with one leg.
Don't have to be black folk, but black folks had livestock all throughout.
The ones that had sense.
You got to pay them.
You probably had it.
You gonna have to pay them.
I didn't have it.
Let me share this. Let me share this with you because I'm not gonna go back and forth with you about
and I'm not neither.
Some money because the church is well taken care of before you came. We're trying to allow you to be blessed because the blessings of the Lord, according to you,
giving my money away, Pastor ain't gonna bless me.
Okay. You're not giving it away. You're doing what God say do with it. You're not giving it away.
You got a chair and a desk in here too?
I don't need nothing to tell you the truth.
Let me share with you what happens normally when people don't tithe. When people don't tithe, normally they'll end up being sick. They'll take it to the doctor. They'll take it to the dentist. And
that's why I tithe.
Because God is going to eventually get his.
That's why I tithe.
Yeah.
That's all we need right there. That's all we need right there. That last couple seconds, I mean, it was hilarious throughout, but those last couple seconds infuriated me for personal reasons, which I'll share in a minute. But he said, yo, let me tell you what happens normally when people don't tithe. You end up going to the doctors, to the dentist. God's going to get his money. Y'all talk to me about that.
It's like a shake. It's a shakedown, man. It's a shake.
I can't believe you said that. That's crazy. That's crazy.
Yo, it's like God sends his leg breaker to you. Like,
I'll start with the thumbs. You got 2 weeks to pay up.
Oh my gosh.
And the crazy thing is people really believe that though. I mean, what he's saying is a common thing. That's a common thought. A guy's gonna get his either you can give it voluntarily or he's gonna take it. What's the whole point of even asking me for it if you're just gonna take it anyway? It's like, and how does that equate to you taking it? Like me getting sick and having to pay a hospital, you're taking it? That's going to you?
No. It's not. It doesn't.
No, it's a threat. Right. It's a
threat. It doesn't
threat.
have to
it's
go
a threat.
to God as long as it ain't going to you no more. Like that's the,
right.
I'm going to take it from your pocket. That's the point. Yeah, you're going to end up having to spend it.
It's odd because
we can do this the hard way. We can do this the easy way or the hard way, basically.
$20 is just $1.
That's just $1.
That was ridiculous.
Yeah. But if you heard the man, he says what normally happens when people don't give is, they'll end up having to go to the doctors, the dentist, whatever. And the guy said, "That's why I give." Almost like I know the program. I'm not saying I'm not with the program. I'm just saying I can't give more than I've been given. But I'm paying my protection money. Like, don't threaten me. Don't threaten me like that. I'm paying.
No wonder why the dude called me a snitch. Just the freaking mob.
This is the mob, yeah.
Well, so
it's the mob, man. It's the mob, yo.
Ichabod. I'll tell a personal story. This is back when I was a Christian. I remember I was riding in the car with a family member, and I remember asking her, she was in a little bit of debt. And I said, because I know this family member pays their tithes and offerings, and they understand, the tithe was an Old Testament thing, but they just want to make sure that they're giving. I said, you don't think it would be wise to maybe you're paying a lot every month in tithes and offering. You don't think God might want you to get out of debt too? Like maybe you do that and then you can go back to give. And this person, just kind of argued me down like, no, I gotta give. And I said, well, why do you have to give? And they said, because that's how I get blessed. And I'm, thinking about biblical passages, and I'm trying I think I know what you might be talking about, but what do you mean? That's how you get blessed. How do you get blessed from giving? I wasn't saying you don't. I'm just trying to figure out, how do you believe you get blessed from giving? And this person said to me, all kind of ways. Like, I get protected from dangers seen and unseen. And, there was a time when I almost got hit by a bus, but, I believe God looked out for me. And I said, pause. Do you realize what you're basically saying is that you're paying protection money to God, as if you stop giving, you will get hit by that bus next time, or you will. And she,
absent from the body, present with the
Lord. But she thought about it like, dang, that's kind of weird. But here's the other thing, though. There are people who pay tithes and offerings. They still end up going to the doctors and having to pay money, and the dentist, and getting hit by buses. So once again, how do you know that the thing you're doing to be in a relationship with this being is actually working, and that it's not just some naturalistic thing that you've gotten used to explaining to yourself a particular way? How do you know?
No, was it the subjective inner testimony of the Spirit? That's what there's really no real answer to that. I think it's a way to just feel like, oh, well, I think honestly there are things in life where people do it, and at the end of the day, even if stuff hits the fan, they could say, well, I know it's not because I didn't do my part. I feel like for some people that's enough of a motivation. It's like, at the end of the day, if it does go left, I don't want to have the thought, well, maybe I should have gave my tithes. So it's sort of like insurance for one's own conscience.
Wow.
Brady, you don't think that I don't know, it's these kinds of beliefs tend, well, number one, they're they kind of remind me of any other religion, or where you're offering something to appease the gods, right? Things like that. But do you think that even in churches that do kind of preach the gospel, or do their best in doing that, do you think that these views are prevalent even, I know you're talking about how the gathering and how ecclesiastical things and how pastors the rhetoric they use is manipulative, but do you think that in a sense overshadows the message in and of itself as well? Is that
so? I was fortunate to have spent a lot of my time as a Christian in churches that A, did not preach the tithe, and B, preached giving from a cheerful heart. And this is going to sound weird to say, I think it's a skill to talk to people about giving in a way. It's almost like you have to find a way to guilt them to give without them realizing that it's guilt. So think about Paul. It was it 2 Corinthians 8 where he talks about giving, and he talks about, I want to test your sincerity. I want to test your love. I want to see how much you love. This other church gave this much. I want to test your sincerity. I want to see what you're willing to do so that this ministry can continue. As if it's some kind of spiritual competition, or it's some kind of a test of your spiritual zeal. And so you're not doing what the tithing pastors say, where you're robbing God and He's going to get you if you don't give, but you are sort of making the believer feel like if you really loved the Lord, you would. What's that? If you really love me, you'd let me. It's the abuser or the. Yeah. There's something I don't want to say it like that because I don't want people who are in ministry to feel like I'm trying to put them out there like that. But I do think there is something to being able to. Is it manipulation?
Well,
or is it
you
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Man, when I was in Reformed churches that didn't teach the tithe because the tithe was part of the ceremonial law, but they would point to passages like what you read from Acts and say, if anything, they were given far more than the tithe.
Yeah, I've heard that.
And then you go to like 1 Corinthians 16 and he'll be like, lay aside on the first day of the week, a sum of money in keeping with what God has, how God has prospered you. I mean, that's biblical teaching from 1 Corinthians 16. There's no way around it. And so they would say, okay, yeah, Abraham gave the tithe to Melchizedek, but you are to get, and that was, mind you, that was before the giving of the law. So a lot of reformers will say, he gave a tithe to Melchizedek before the law was given in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. So that the law, this sort of principle of giving a tenth of your income precedes the giving of the law on Sinai. And therefore, it's something that even Abraham knew about before the law had come. And you see it picked up on in the New Testament. They're giving much more than a tenth. They're selling everything they have. So if anything, people speak about the superabundance of the new covenant. Like, whereas you may have had a particular number in the past, now we supersede that, So this is just piggybacking on you. I'm just saying, like,
good. It's good stuff.
I think that they, if anything, could guilt a person by saying, well, if you're giving a tenth, you might be doing the bare minimum. I've heard a Reformed preacher say that.
I've heard that.
Yeah.
More we could say, but I will ask this, and I'll say this for myself. Since either of you have stopped giving your tenth or your offering, did the
I
locust
have more
come?
money in my pocket.
Did the locust come and eat up your harvest?
No, and everybody will die of something. Everybody will get sick at some point. So that's just another way of just scaring people and manipulating them. It's like, it's like, I think I saw somebody reference Christopher Hitchens dying a godless death. And it's like, bro, everybody's going to die. So regardless of what you actually believe, you don't have insulation from death. So the sooner you come to a point in your life where you can accept the facts of life, the fact that you're going to die and that you really can't, there are things you can do. You can stop smoking and exercise and eat healthier. But outside of basic stuff, you're going to experience what everybody else has experienced before us. And you can't manipulate your way by, if you're going to give charitably, just give charitably. I've said
this. Okay.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I've said this several times before. Like, It's what religion is good for. It, whether it be false or not, there's something comforting about giving you the impression that you're able to manipulate the physical world by tapping into these non-physical realities. And so whether it be the tithe or whether it be the giving, whether it be the, it's comforting to think this is how I do it. This is how I get control over that.
Just take that money and give it to your friends. Give that money to your friends. Give it to your family. Like, that's what I do. If I see friends in need, if I have it to help, I'm going to try to help them out. If it's somebody I love, I'm going to help them out. It's not like you lose that when you're just like, I'm not wasting my money giving it to some institution that's just basically paying people to tell people lies.
That's harsh.
Yeah. You can say amen or ouch.
Yeah, I was in my 20s, I was making $40K a year living in New York City and, seeing clergy people having six-figure salaries, right? So to me, it at some point bothered me, being in that situation and kind of seeing that. But yeah, not having to be obligated to do, to tithe and to, yeah, it's a relief. It's a big difference. Did the locust come in some form or not, or things like that? I mean, coming out of grad school was really difficult for me to, really get into a new career and, jumping through all the hoops and, getting really good at what I do was a lot of hard work. It was a lot of, it was all on me and in terms of, the people that I associated with and, my coworkers as well as classmates and things like that. I mean, all this stuff, requires a community to get better in whatever your domain is, right? And the stronger community we have in, and I'm not talking about church, I'm talking about like how this is how humans operate, right? No one can really succeed in isolation. So whatever God and in his sovereignty or whatnot, it's like there are so many. There are Christians that are successful and not successful. There are non-Christians that are both as well. So this is something that I learned very early on. So yeah,
I appreciate that idea of, you said, the work that you had to put in, and it's on you. Like whether you're successful or not, it's on you. I remember feeling that when I deconverted. It was a little frightening, but also freeing, but then empowering when I had to say, okay, so then whether or not I succeed or not, it's on me. And, I can't like pray and give and God's going to give the increase and, none of that. Like what I put in is what I'm going to get out. And it really did motivate me to give 110% because I want that. I want to be able to reap the harvest from my work.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know why it's not apparent to people that not giving 1/10 of your income to some organization is actually a way to build savings. I don't know why that should be. I don't know. It's an odd, uneven. Well, I understand because they think that there's this other supernatural element, but it's an uneven application. They talked about the tripartite division of the law, the moral, the ceremonial, and the civil law, and it's just interesting. Like I say, that's why a lot of Reformed pastors try to go back to Abraham paying the tithe to Melchizedek because that precedes the giving of the law. So they try to say that this general principle always existed. So I guess that's how they try to do it, but they often appeal to Malachi, which is the passage that guy quoted, if I'm not mistaken, in that video. He was quoting from Malachi. Yeah.
So there is one last thing that we'll look at, there's plenty more, that I think qualifies those making the promises found in the Bible as participating in a catfish. It's when you're constantly having to shore people up on what it is that we're looking forward to. It's okay that you give up X, Y, or Z now because of what you're looking forward to. I think it was Paul that kind of set this trend, though I'm sure we could find things in the gospel that would echo this as well. Remember, Paul wrote first before the gospels. But Paul says, for I reckon that the sufferings of this life are not worthy to be compared to the glories that will be revealed. There's something that you're looking forward to, so don't worry about what you're giving up here and now. And if you tune into people in the online skeptic community, atheist community, agnostic community, you'll hear people say things like, this is the only life that I know I'm going to have. So does it really make sense for me to be giving up this life for a life that I know not whether or not it's ever going to come? But I want to play something because maybe it is. Maybe it does make sense. Here goes some encouragement to do just that. To not focus so much on this life, but to be thinking about the life to come.
Good old Piper.
You can read theology 10 hours a day, 40 years long, and not know God as beautiful, all satisfying, highest treasure of your life. Cares about knowing God the way the devil knows God. He hates everybody. Knowledge of God helps him hate people. We're talking about knowing God here in 1 Thessalonians. They don't know God. They don't know God really as who he is, infinitely valuable, infinitely beautiful, infinitely satisfying, why your soul was made. There are more pleasures at his right hand, more eternal joys in his presence that you could have in 10,000 sexual trysts. The question is, do you know that?
All right. Do you know that? Albert, as a Christian, how much would this have stirred your soul?
Well, it did in one sense back then. Mm-hmm. I listened to a lot of Piper, his whole Christian hedonism thing, and it was compelling at the time. He's differentiating here between knowledge and, I guess
experience,
knowing, right? Experience, yeah. Sure, mm-hmm. Experience, and I don't know how much I would necessarily, agree with how he's trying to make that divide, I guess, in some ways. But the thing is, for me, I always, felt that I had a very intimate experience with God because of, understanding, my sinfulness and having God's promises being fulfilled in a man, and came down as divine but human, and having, the whole imputed righteousness. And
so I hope people who are watching this understand what Albert just said. Like, if you've ever doubted whether or not anyone on this podcast had a real conversion, Albert is listening to this soul-stirring message by John Piper and saying, even as a believer, he wasn't even necessarily motivated by what God was going to be revealing one day. At his right hands are pleasures forevermore, and eye hasn't seen, ear hasn't heard what God has in store for those who love. Albert said, just what I've already experienced in the God that I knew, having my sins forgiven, being reconciled, just the knowledge of that was almost enough. Like, you don't have that sort of appreciation for salvation and not have the Christian experience. Like, so I hope y'all catch what Albert said just there. I mean, I think that's important to reckon with. Last question for you, Albert, before I throw it to Jay Witt.
Sure.
Hearing this now, does any of it make you say, "Oh man, I'm going to miss out"?
No, no, of course not. Yeah, no, it's an interesting question because I do have a very strong memory of. It's kind of weird. This is, when I use cannabis, sometimes I get these flashbacks to when I had these experiences, and it kind of brings me back completely, and it's like for a moment I feel like I was back, before my deconversion, and just kind of feeling that for a minute, and just thinking about how much it all meant to me, and but then I it's weird because I could have that separation. I could kind of move right back to where I am now. So, but no, it's like. It's just not true. That's the whole thing. It's like, it's just not true. That's as simple as I can.
You would
put
have
it.
to
It's not-
catfish yourself to get back into that.
Correct.
that place.
Correct.
Interesting.
I don't know how that catfishing method would happen or what form it would take, but yeah, correct. It would have to be something completely deceptive.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Jay Witt, does this do anything? Did this do anything for your soul at one point? What does it do now?
Well, I mean, I think there's always been, and there are a lot of Reformed Christians who have problems with the way Piper bifurcates the Christian experience, particularly in terms of epistemology, because in his Christian hedonistic approach, he more or less equates. Let me say this correctly. He makes it a sin to not have certain affections. But the way, and he would say, "Oh, that's a biblical thing. You're supposed to, have, the lack of certain affections is sinful." But by making it, how do I say this? His description of what that looks like for instance, where he says, inglorious presentation of glorious truths is sinful, sometimes can fall into this really gray area that's very subjective. And I feel like here, what we're getting with this epistemic presentation, where he's saying, he's bifurcating. I believe it's somewhat of a bifurcation fallacy, particularly if you're a biblical Christian and you look at passages like it's at Ephesians 1, it was 15 downward, where he talks about praying that you would have a spirit of wisdom and revelation and the knowledge of Christ. I mean, how else? I mean, it's almost like he scoffs at the concept of just a certain kind of theological knowledge in the books. And then he's like, who cares if you know that? Well, can you really separate? The question that a Christian should be thinking about here, or any person, is how can you, if your religion, as Brady pointed out in the last podcast, the stuff has been written down. Like you're not actually experiencing many of the things that you're being told to believe, but you're being told to look at the written account of them to basically hinge your faith on that written account. So how can one writer in John commend that to you, and then you're being commended to know things, but all the things that you're being commended to know are basically written about in a book. And then when a person gets to the business of reading this book, then you say, well, who cares if you know it that way? Even Satan knows it that way. He just knows it so he can hate people. It's like, well, bro, like, you've been told me, you tell me when I come in the door that I have to get to know this person. I'm gonna know this person intimately, but there is clearly a divide between his ontology.
Jay, wait, can I interject? Not only that, he's also asking you to love him with all your heart, with all affection, with all, like, there can't be an ounce of doubt, an ounce of, you know what I mean? It's like it has to be almost like a perfect affection for God. That's it seems to be the call that Piper is making here. So,
and I know you're going to get people kicking back and say that's not what he means, but it's just like...
Well, those who understand Christian hedonism would actually... Right, that's essentially the thesis that your affection has to be that's the goal.
White hot, more or less
because
white hot.
Isn't it for Piper? Isn't that like that's the only way you're going to not live a life of sin? Like it's
correct.
Loving God that way, is going to keep you from sin.
It's when
but understand
duty just like fades away completely. So go ahead, Jerry. Sorry.
But no. I mean, I like the fact that we're kind of. I don't mind you just interjecting either. Like, that's fine. But understand what he's saying. This is why people will look at Brady and say, okay, he went to the cemetery. He went to seminary and he got involved in the head. It's this bifurcation fallacy that Piper is presenting here. This is a consistent theme when people leave, like myself or maybe even you. They'll be like, well, yeah, you got to know the book stuff, but you didn't get to know. And if you really try to grasp a hold of what he's commending to his audience, you can't grasp a hold of it. It is literally like a bait and switch. There's no way. How are you going to get to know? You're commending something so subjective. And this is why some Reformed people who don't apostatize, incidentally, they actually have a problem with what he's presenting here because they see this as too amorphous, too subjective. And basically non-scriptural is like, what kind of knowledge are you supposed to have? I mean, of course, there's this, I guess, what they would call the subjective experience of the. It's
almost like he's preaching a certain kind of ecstasy here.
Yes, right.
Well, for sure, yeah. It's almost like the monks of the Middle Ages. Yeah, for sure.
Right.
Yeah. You're going to find yourself so enraptured in this relationship. And like you said, no one can even tell you what that is or what that looks like. It's pleasures at his right hand, more pleasurable,
Psalm
more enjoyable
16.
than 10,000 sexual trysts. It's like
that's Psalm 16, right? At the right hand, at the right
I'm
hand.
not sure which psalm it is, but just that idea of let me hone in on something that is tangible, right? 1,000 sexual trysts. You can imagine the physical pleasure and that's quantifiable. But I'm going to dwarf that with something that's unquantifiable and unexplainable, and I want you to set your affections on that. Set your affections on things above. Set your affections on all these things that you really can't, like you said, you can't quantify, it's intangible. And some kind of way, I want you to base your life on this thing that I can never explain to you, I can never show you, and you may never actually get. And in the process, give up all these other things that are right in front of you.
Yeah, I think honestly this is so profound because it's you're pulling people into this religion and you're telling them they're going to get to know this person. I mean, that's what they say. Salvation is basically
to know him.
Is you being united with the person of Christ, right? And you come to know the person of Christ not in some sort of ecstatic, mystical thing, but you come to know him, at least according to many of these reformers, through the text. And then it's just interesting how that's what you're being presented at the door, and then you graduate to this level and you get to a person like Piper who's like, who cares? It almost like you get what I'm saying? It's almost like he's shunning the fact that shunning is the wrong word. But you know what I'm saying? Yeah. There's almost a certain kind of scorn for that kind of knowledge. Who cares? You went to seminary. Who cares? You're wretched person, individual. You're wretched. You know Christ the way the devil knows him, and he hates everybody. It's like, what are you telling me? Like, what are you commending to me?
Well, there is a scriptural basis for that almost. Even the demons believe and tremble.
And they tremble.
So believing is not even good enough. There's got to be more.
But see that passage is being taken out of context if you're using it, because what he's trying to say is in that passage he's trying to commend, I think that's in James, he's trying to tell you have to act on your belief. He's not saying that belief. You see what I mean? So
yeah.
it's a little bit of a misapplication of that passage, because he's not saying, he's actually saying the opposite of what Paul was saying. James is presenting an antithetical case for justification. He's saying, hey, you must believe in a way that leads to action. He's not saying you need to believe, you need to study or to know epistemically, or in a way that is divorced from the book. That's not what that passage is for. It's not to say that. He's not trying to commend belief in some sort of, or it's not even belief in this case with Piper. He's conflating knowledge. He's conflating knowledge into that passage, which is really about how a person is justified in James. You see what I'm saying? And I know this sounds like it's just crazy. I think this exhibits just how insane this whole endeavor ends up getting. It's just like you created a huge problem, and what he's telling you is not enough. So here you are, you've been baptized, you've been catechized, you've assented to you know the Apostles' Creed, you're in seminary, and he's scorning you. He's saying, like, dude, that's not enough. That's not enough. You need to have this profound feeling that's, I guess, more. It's interesting that he used the sexual escapade. I think that's
well, as a Christian hedonist, isn't that one of his big go-tos? Is sexual pleasure? Doesn't he often talk about?
No. I'm asking you. What do you guys think? Do you feel like it's interesting that he's contrasting this knowledge, which there was nothing about it that seems inherently sexual, that he's contrasting that with sex?
So what he's alluding to probably is how the Puritans, especially the ones in America, and I'm talking about even Jonathan Edwards, and is that the Puritans used very, very what do they call it? I think the phrase is literally making love to Christ. That was literally the phrase that the Puritans used in terms of trying to attain this kind of religious affection that, is epitomized in Edwards' work. So this is where Piper is trying to filter that down into how he preaches today. So it's, Piper believes, as well as D.A. Carson and all them, that what they're wanting to see happen is another, awakening of the evangelical awakening, right? That's what they want to see revived again in their lifetime. So that's why the rhetoric is so strong. It's so unbearably strong, actually, to the point where it's just so it's like, and how it ties into what you're kind of saying, Brady, here is very interesting. So yeah.
All right, well, let's close on this note. I'm going to read this. I'll show it. I'm going to read this comment that somebody left under one of our videos on YouTube, and see if this doesn't tie it all in terms of the catfish or the bait and switch.
Right.
So this person says, I am quite literally on the fence between belief and unbelief. Some days I wake up convinced Christianity is true, and then other days I think it's all a lie. I've been a Christian for 30 plus years and reformed for 20 of those years. Let me just stop right there. We got a lot of people who come into our comments, and especially mine on Facebook, and try to blame the fact or the idea of any of us being reformed for our falling away. And I'll just say, I was not fully reformed. I liked some of the way the reform dealt with the scriptures. I had a problem with limited atonement, but I saw some of the things that the reformers said in the scriptures, but I also saw some Arminian ideas, and so I had reserved the right to wait on that. So I wasn't.
Oh well, there you go. There you have it.
Right. So
there you have it.
Once again,
that's why he apostatized.
whatever it takes to explain my apostasy. But this guy says I was a Christian I've been a Christian for 30 years, was reformed for 20 of those years. I really enjoyed this talk. He's talking about one of our videos, and I can view it from both sides. So he's kind of got two minds right now. The side of him that's
double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. Go ahead.
The side of him that's deconverting and the side of him that wakes up some days still a Christian. He says, I am now having a crisis of faith every other week or so. And the more I read, or the more I read and learn. So my heart, broke for this person when I read this part. I'm now having a crisis of faith every other week or so. The more I read and learn. So think about this, those who are watching. The more you read and learn, does this make you want to shut your eyes, turn your brain off, or does this make you say, there must be some things I actually need to read and learn? Because maybe there's some things I need to know. What does this do for you? So he says, going through this process, I caused my wife to have a crisis of faith prior to myself, and she actually stopped going to church 3 weeks ago. I've actually, so don't blame us, it's not our podcast, it's not my book. This is something that somebody's already going through. I've actually still attended church because I'm good at manipulating / forcing facts to fit the Christian worldview. We talked about that, right? What facts? Well, local flood, post-millennial / preterist, OE or old earth creationist, etc. I'm even now okay with Genesis 1 to 11 as Hebrew, ancient Near Eastern mythology. I'm even okay with a fabricated conquest by Joshua. That didn't really happen. Or the documentary hypothesis, that's JEDP theory. Or even a fabricated Exodus. Maybe that didn't even happen. He said, I'm even okay with all that. The more I read and learn, the more I'm having to say, okay.
He's making concessions.
Right. It's almost like the tide is taking away the sand from the shore. The further it comes in, the further these facts or these ideas come in, it's like, man, the shoreline is retreating. So he says, as the list of the lack of literal truth grows, the more doubt I have, and the more the Bible seems to gaslight its truth and politics. This brother is, I think it's a male, this person is thinking through their faith and saying, man, the list is growing of things that I can't take literally, and because of that, my faith is shrinking.
It's like I said to you months ago when I said, it's like having a car that's a jalopy, and there's, you get the transmission fixed, then the tires go out. Eventually, it's like, I just need to get rid of this whole thing and just get a new car, because you see what I mean? Like, there's a hole here. There's like, you got.
But what do you do when you have so much riding on it? Like this person says, I feel like a lot is on the line because I have 8 children. Oldest who is 15 years old, who I've raised in the church their whole lives, looking up to me. So yeah, the car might be breaking down, but I got so many people in it. How do I pull this thing over and tell them?
There's one answer for this. Yeah. There's one answer for this. With these kinds of things, it doesn't get better with time. The longer you wait, the day you hear our voice, harden not your heart, brother.
And this is not to make light. I've talked to this person, I think.
No, I'm not making light of him at all. I felt the urgency. Yeah. I felt the urgency. When I left, I had several... I'm not going to disclose all of the biographical things just for the sake of anonymity, but there were several reasons why it was an urgency, and it was just like, don't wait until you've invested even one more day. Yeah. And I'm not saying this joking around. Yeah. Even another day is a day where you're deepening. It's like that which isn't helping you is hurting you.
I had the same experience. I got to the point where I said, I spent 30 years into this. It's not getting another day out of me.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I hear
all
you,
that
man.
to say,
and I feel for you, brother. Whatever your name is, I feel for you, and I know, I may have even joked earlier. I said, you don't want to be a double-minded man that's unstable. I was just kind of joking around, but I understand the gravity of the situation you're describing, and it's not a joking matter. And yeah, this is what we mean when we're talking about how insidious this thing is, and how and this is why for all of the detractors who will say, why are you leaving? Why don't you just leave quietly? Because I don't want other people to go through what I went through, and I don't want people going through with this dude. That's why. It's not like I lost a sense of conscience and a heart for people when I left the church.
I still have it, and it's beating even harder now because I see.
You guys don't have a monopoly on that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Stop acting like you got a monopoly on having feelings for people's and compassion. Like, it didn't start with the Bible, it doesn't end with it. And I feel for this brother, and I want him to have a good life. And I feel like the sooner he can get this together, the better off he'll be. Sorry for talking over you, Brady, but it's just enraging that people they try to act like they have a monopoly on all things good. Yeah. When you get what I'm saying?
I got you. Al, any thoughts on this before we sign off?
Lastly, that I think it's also ironic that this is a kind of hell he's experiencing, right? When you're being pulled this way. So the fact that Christians don't acknowledge how real this is and how important this is and how utterly they have no idea. Right, they have no idea how some people have to suffer through these things, and this is why we're here talking about it. And I think Jay Witt summed it up really well just now. So that's it.
So don't want to end on a somber note. So we stand as living proof that there is life after faith. So anybody who's having to think about whether or not it's time to pull the ripcord. There is life after faith.
I just had a thought.
Yeah.
I just had a thought. This brother said his oldest child is 15 years old, and he raised them. Where did he say it?
At the bottom.
At the bottom. Yeah. I feel like a lot is on the line because I have 8 children. This brother was invested, by the way. He's probably one of those guys who felt like he needed to raise a covenantal household. Oldest is 15. Brother, understand. As a parent myself, one of the best things you can do for your kid is to show them that you're capable of changing your way of being to accord with
reality,
information that is factual and true. You don't have any obligation to keep a charade up, a lie up, just because you told your son will respect you to know that he raised me up like this because this was what he believed to be true until he couldn't believe it to be true anymore, and then he told me as much. That's the way to go. Show it's nothing wrong. There is nothing wrong with being wrong. There's nothing wrong with being wrong if you're willing to admit it and to amend your ways.
There's a lot riding on that, though, because, one of the things that people do with religion is this stitches your world together. So as a child, if this is what undergirds your world, and it's one thing for an adult to have to take this apart. Life doesn't end, but for a child, I can understand someone saying, this might be the reason why my child does good in school. This might be the reason why, they don't misbehave when mommy and daddy are gone. There's a lot of things that you have to take into account when you.
Everything you're saying there, they could say applies to you as they could say it applies to an adult.
No, true, but I'm saying for an adult, I think it's not necessarily easier as much as the responsibility. You can understand the adult taking the responsibility.
When I hear that, I hear the arguments people make for the reason why we have to have religion in society, because it restrains people. Because people make that exact same argument, and it's like it's a fallacious.
Yeah,
argument.
I'm not saying that that's not,
and I know you're saying
a reason to break this to his children and all. I'm just saying this is why somebody might have the hesitancy about doing it.
Yeah, he might have the hesitancy, but I just don't think that, bro. Like, what are you gonna do? It comes down to what I always say. What's the alternative? What's the alternative? Live a lie for the rest of your life? Live a lie in front of your kid? I mean, as a person who believes that like Christianity doesn't have a monopoly on morality, I don't think that lying is great. I don't think like living a lie is a good thing. So you gotta live your truth, man. and let the chips fall where they may. You'd be surprised. There's a valuable, I know people are saying, oh, what if his kids are doing well? There's a valuable lesson in this for your kid. And it's the lesson of you don't have to commit to something 30 years ago and be it now just because you committed to it 30 years ago. That you can change your beliefs.
You can go where the evidence leads.
You said it better than I could have said it. You can go, that's a valuable, if that's not a valuable lesson, there is nothing in life that's a valuable lesson. Because that's the problem with our political discourse. It's the problem with so many things. People of what they used to call party line. They come to a conclusion and they just stick to it. They don't care how, you get what I'm saying.
Yeah. So hopefully, if anybody knows this person's YouTube, like, oh, they're talking about stuff. We're not trying to beat up on anyone, nor are we trying to expose someone. This was a public comment. I thought it deserved a public discussion as we wrapped up this idea of catfishers of men. And I guess, signing off, I challenge believers. I know several believers. We've been having great conversations, behind closed doors all year long around my deconversion. These are people who are getting more and more liberal. This whole list this person went through, from local flood to preterist view to old earth creation, to all that. I know believers who are getting more and more liberal by the day, trying to embrace these things. And I challenge all of you. You've got to ask yourself, are you a catfisher of men? Do you want to live that way? Can you look at yourself in the mirror doing that to people? I couldn't. I challenge you. Yeah. So we out on that note.
It's a good word.
Hey, we out on that note. We'll catch y'all next time. Ichabod.